Well, I'm going to start because who shows up on time deserve to hear the story firsthand. I hope many of you enjoyed this morning's session, and it was a full audience, only I couldn't see it, so I'm delighted that we have the lights on. We're going to keep it this way because we want to involve you in this conversation as well. It's not just who's on stage. So how many of you actually attended this morning's session so I can get a sense of, I should have asked the question the other way around, how many people didn't? A couple, good. We're going to be repeating a tiny little bit at the beginning of this, but not a whole lot, just to build the story a little bit. And I also want to say thank you to Gary Morganson, I was going to say Stoller, President Stoller, and Eric McLaughlin with Exavere for joining us this afternoon. They will have plenty of good stories for us. So to kick into this topic, it's an important one for Oregon right now, and that's how do we build a sustainable business, a business that has profitability long-term, that you can be excited about. And just to get back to who's in this audience, I'm going to ask the same question this morning. How many of you are selling more than 5,000 cases in the market today? Oh, it's actually a good number. I would say about 45% or so. And that's good. We're going to be hitting on not just 5,000 case models this afternoon, but also 10, 20,000. So for those who are looking to grow, we'll be going deeper into that topic. How many of you are actually looking, I think I should be clicking my clicker here. One second. I'm in charge of the presentation. And transition. How many of you are going through a transition? Let it be growth, let it be succession, preparing for a sale, anything, okay, good number, again about 40%. And how many of you are looking to become more profitable? There better be all hands in the air. Otherwise, there's some good winemaking classes down the road. How to take the bread out of your wine. So what's driving this topic, again, are the headlines we've seen where Oregon is looking to become more profitable, and also the generational shift that we talked about this morning, where at an industry level, where so many more folks, about 50% of the vineyard and winery owners out there are at that point in their lives where they're looking to shift and potentially sell either to their kids or to a third party. And so that's reflected here as well. And having just moved up from California last May, I'm seeing a lot more wineries actually going through generational continuity than I saw down south. So it's a challenging but exciting time up here. The issue here, though, is if you take the concept of generational shift and the need to sell to your kids, to employees, to whoever you need to in the next 5 to 10 years, we're looking at an era of competition that's really significant. And if we listen to Rob McMillan and listen to Christian Miller this morning, or read the Wine Business Monthly press last week, we know that there are over 9,000 American domestic wineries that are competing for less than 10% of the U.S. wine market, and roughly 30 companies, wineries, that are owning the 90% of the market. So it's a real challenging time. And then you have consolidation of retail and wholesale on top of that. So we're going to be talking a lot about direct-to-consumer today, as well as some other things that help drive profitability and position. We know this doesn't happen automatically. We know that growth and stability and sustainability is not something that happens automatically. It takes good hard work and discipline. And we also know that the wine business is really not that easy. It's rather complex. And the good news is you're not alone in trying to figure this out. Wish I had the screen from this morning. I could have actually controlled my slides a little bit better. So what's keeping you up at night? I spoke recently with 40 winery CEOs and building out a next generation CEO roundtable, and their concerns were about the same stuff: cash flow, profitability, setting goals, putting the right resources in place, hiring the right people. And they also are very concerned about how do you build a healthy business. So that's a snapshot that drove this topic today. When you think about what it takes, well, I would say that fundamentally, if you're interested in growth, and growth doesn't have to be in volume, by the way, growth many times we're talking about profits and what you keep. There are three things to think about. There's the issue, of course, of the levers you can pull to actually drive the value in your business. There's cases produced versus sold, being able to balance that out. There's pricing that you can pull as well, and then certainly the channel and product mix, which can also drive contribution margins and the right kind of revenues for your business. The other is you want to make sure that you're optimizing your business to metrics before you actually think about growth. So take what it takes, put the discipline and the practices in place, have a profitable business before you try to grow in volume. And otherwise, you're building on sand. And then the third point here is that if you build out good plans, and that includes capital plans, you have a much better chance of actually delivering something that's really valuable to you. So taking the time to do that. Otherwise, I've seen a lot of folks fall in their place. They pull things out of their entrepreneurial phase where it's a lot easier, but as you grow, you have more complexity involved. And at this point, I'm going to turn this over to Keith, and he'll be spending about 15 minutes on presentation, then I will, and then we'll have 45 minutes for the panel that's with us here today. There you go.
Thanks, Deb. Let's see if I can arrange this where I can see the screen and be heard on the microphone at the same time here. Okay. A good chunk of you are here this morning, so you're going to see some slides coming up that are going to look really familiar. As a matter of fact, one will be absolutely identical to what we talked about this morning. And I do understand that some of the numbers were a little small, so if you'd like to see, I think they get a copy of the original PowerPoint if you fill out the survey, so you'll have the information there much clearer. And then if you need anything else from me on the numbers, then just come talk to me either today or tomorrow. So we're going to be talking about 3 different models. We're going to start with the 5,000 case model that we talked about this morning, and then we're going to build a bit on it. Deb asked one specific question early on.
Let me move this over so you can actually see the screen.
Oh. Well, that was just too smart. Sorry. Wow. That's a point, sometimes just little tweaks make all the difference in the world, and so we just have to be open to them. So what drives different value in different business models? And Deb set it up. One of the questions you get asked is, and I'm going to ask this more specifically later on when we're moderating the panel, is, when we make decisions to grow, what goes into making that decision? And one of the things that Deb mentioned in there is you grow once you've maximized what you have already. At least that's one of my mantras that my clients hear all the time from me. So we're going to be talking about running your business versus not having your business run you. We're going to go through 3 models, a 5,000 case model, 10,000 case model, and then 20,000. We'll talk a little bit about what happens in between. The premise is we're going to apply the best practices. So we're going to start with our sort of optimized 5,000 case model this morning and then build a little bit on that and then spring it forward to a larger size. We're also going to be talking about, there are a lot of times when I talk to folks in this industry, they sometimes just sort of fall into the situation they're in instead of strategically thinking forward into where they're going and why they're going that direction. And I'm sure the panel will have some pretty good tidbits on what happens, both good and bad, when you have the business run you. So we're going to talk at our 5,000 case winery. This will look, for the ones that were in this morning, this is exactly the same slide we had this morning. 5,000 case winery. This was the optimized model where you're getting $234 per case. You're dropping $90,000 cash flow and $100,000 cash to the bottom, or operating profit to the bottom line there. So if you remember originally, this was a break-even winery that we made a few tweaks. I'm saying we should at least anticipate, take a look, what if we were to instead set our per case or per bottle price, retail price, at the 100 metric. We are able to do it at the 90 metric. In other words, we are able to take our $35 bottle of wine to 40, in essence, have that 10% increase. If we were to do that with doing everything else, all of a sudden then our revenues per case would be up to $260 a case. And then all of those little bogeys that we are talking about this morning about our return on our investment, as you can see at the bottom of the slide, is now 19%. And our operating margin is now at 15%. So this is, I would say, for the Oregon market, as it sits right now, a very profitable winery here. Now, as you would say, maybe in Sonoma there's some more room to grow in here. But for Oregon, this is a well-run winery here. And if I were to be hired to come in and value it, I would assume there would be, depending upon the capital structure, I would assume there would be some intangible value in this winery that we could allocate to brand. So, and I would say at this point, now is when you make the decision to grow. And when you do, we have a 10,000 case winery. If we just doubled everything else being basically the same except for we're going to actually, at 10,000 cases, we're not going to be able to direct to consumer 50%. So we're going to have to back that off a bit, and you'll see how that happens here once we summarize it at a couple of slides from now.
So I can ask the question, Keith. In this mode, you're assuming that they're building an existing capacity or they're outsourcing the winemaking?
Mostly building existing capacity onto it.
Okay.
But I didn't leave a lot of room in there. They're not, throwing $1 million into taking this from 5,000 to 10,000 cases. So I would say they would have to be doing it, but they'd be doing it on a relative shoestring budget in here, okay? They would leverage it to the degree that they could. Basically, I've got, at this point, all fixed assets are leveraged about 65-70% by a bank and the rest. And, of course, inventory, which is a big elephant in this situation, that's all something that you have to capitalize yourself. So, and one thing you need to keep in mind, to grow from a 5,000 case winery to a 10,000 case winery, in this example, you're talking at basically $110,000 of additional inventory per 1,000 cases that you're going to have to build into it. So that's a lot to bootstrap in 1 year. As a matter of fact, I'm pretty sure that it would be not impossible, but it would be difficult to do. So this is something that would have to be transitioned over a period of time. Now, what you would get at the end is that you get cash flow of $285,000 at the end. That's compared to $153,000 of cash flow if you were a 5,000 case winery. Okay? So about $130,000 more cash flow by going from 5,000 to 10,000 cases. But if you're thinking, you're saying, well, Keith, you just told me that I'm going to have to put $110,000 per 1,000 cases into inventory. So 5 times $110,000, $550,000 of additional inventory. But I'm only getting $130,000 to $150,000 of additional cash flow a year. So you need to keep in mind that you need kind of a long runway here because it's going to take 4 years if everything works out right to break even after you've gotten to the 10,000 case capacity. So don't enter into this thing without giving that whole process some thought. If you're looking to transition, and 50% of you pretty much raised your hand talking about transitioning, this is not something to embark on now if you're going to transition out halfway through the process. I'm not sure that would be the most strategic way to go through this process. So, and if you were to then take a look at a 20,000 case winery in the same frame of mind, you're going to end up with, you'll see here that the average revenues per case starts getting squeezed down because you have to allocate less to direct consumer and more to distribution. That's the way the numbers work. You can't sell that much wine out of your tasting room. And you do your best to maximize each of those sales channels as much as possible, but there are economies here that are just difficult to get over, especially here in the Willamette Valley. So your operating margin is still a healthy 15%. Your return on your equity is 18.5%, or 18.3% here. You have a very healthy cash flow here, but you have the same issues going through the process from going 5,000 to 10,000 and 10,000 to 20,000 cases. It's going to take a little bit of time to break even during this period of time. So you need to be very strategic. You're going to have to cash flow this thing out. You're going to have to do a projection, a forecast, a good 5 years out from now. And I know it's, well, I don't know what's going to happen next week, Keith. How am I going to know 5 years out? Well, you know what your plan is. You work your plan through the forecast, so you can at least anticipate what your cash flow implications are to your plan and how much capital you're going to need, how much you can borrow, then how much you're going to have to get from other sources. So the summary of the three scenarios, we've got our 5,000 maximized. I won't worry about the baseline at this point. And we have 10,000 cases, and you'll see here that the 5,000 is 50-50 to direct consumer versus distribution. And then direct consumer goes to 40% versus 60%. I still think that's pretty rambunctious. I mean, that's a lot of cases to sell out of, direct to consumer in a situation like this. And then the other one, in the finally 20,000, we go to 6,000 and 14,000. This is going to still require a lot of sales in order to make it work, and these guys will talk a bit about this and what you need to do to make it work. But I wanted to set the stage here. You'll see at the bottom the return on equity, pretty consistent in all three of these cases. These are all viable options that you can do if you want to do it, but you need to understand the implications of each one of these and the time lag it takes in order to be totally ramped up from 5,000 to 10,000 cases and then to go from 10,000 to 20,000 cases. One thing I want to make sure that everyone understands here is if you're not making money at whatever level you're at, let's say at 4,000 cases or 5,000 cases, growing from 5,000 to 10,000 cases is not going to correct that issue. The issue is here now. You need to be profitable at 5,000 cases before you spring to 10,000 cases. You need to maximize where you are now before you get going forward. So I'll get off my soapbox here, but that was the one point I wanted to make sure everyone makes. So Deb, you're up.
9,000. Okay. You're not that short, are you? There we go. That's better. So we're going to talk a little bit about the tipping points. What happens when you grow? What are some of the decisions you have to make, both organizationally, operationally, as well as strategically? And this will then, I think, set the stage for our panel to talk about their experience in doing so. So this is, did I go backwards? I like the one this morning. There was a big green button that said push this and you go forward. Tipping point. So as you grow, complexity increases. And as you go through various growth stages, we call these tipping points. You need to reconsider your plan, your team, and how you govern, how you manage performance. In business, there are essentially three growth stages. There's the entrepreneurial stage. I was already there, sorry, the entrepreneurial stage, I can see it again, where the founder more than likely is working in the business, and there may be a couple family members, but there aren't a whole lot of people beyond that. A lot of services are outsourced, and you end up with pretty much the brand and the business is dominated by the founder's personality. Decisions are made in real time, they're very fluid. As you move into the next growth stage, which tends to be what we call formalization, the founder and the owners will hopefully be working a little bit more on the business, not just in the business, being able to think about the future a little bit and a little bit more strategically. There's a little more delegation, yet the leader, the owner, still maintains a lot of control. There's a need for more cohesive strategy because you have to rise above the competition as you're moving into a formalization stage. Organization complexity increases because you're typically managing a few more people, and decision-making requires more process and more collaboration with your team if you're going to be effective. And then the third tipping point, or the third stage in a business, is what we call maturity. And in maturity, when an owner or a set of owners gets to the stage, it's really important to develop a team of leaders. Not just one leader, but a team of functional leaders. And in this stage, however, in maturity, you also see margins stymie. You hear the expression, grow or die. That's true for a maturity stage in a business. And growth depends on a balance between the control, the ability of the owner and leader to control decisions, but also to provide enough creative freedom to the functional leaders so that you engage the best possible people in your business. So if we look at those tipping points and we think about the fact that a majority of this industry, meaning the wine industry, is privately held or family owned, then there's some other stages we need to consider as well. And I would say that knowing what stage you're in from a business and an ownership standpoint can help you make decisions for what's coming up ahead. So if we look at this as a chart, and at the bottom we have the growth phases I just went through, and along the left side are ownership stages. Nothing's complex here. It's simple, controlling owner stage. And a controlling owner stage, usually the owners or owner in that stage are looking to achieve some degree of financial stability and capitalization. They're trying to figure it out. How do I get cash flow going? And also, how do I think about the ownership model for the next generation or the next stage? So that's what's going on in the controlling ownership stage. Then you will, if you succeed, you move on to something called a sibling partnership. So that would be Maria, you and your sister, right? Ponzi. And so siblings working together to build an ownership team that eliminates family silos is a big part of that phase. And similarly, because you're usually at a later phase of business development and you have multiple owners, you're looking to build management systems and discipline that helps deal with that complexity. And then for those few businesses that actually make it to the next stage, which would be what we call cousin partnerships. So these would be cousins that have grown up in the business, that would be the children of Maria and her sister. And because cousins don't usually come from the same family branch, they usually have different cultures and different values. It's a lot more complex, and so managing a large, more diverse family situation and relationships is a key part of this phase. And then creating investment funds. And what I mean by investment funds is enough money left in the business or around the family who owns the business to help stabilize things so that there's a funding business that can support larger ownership needs or reinvesting in the business or shareholder liquidity. Because at that point, if you have too many owners around, especially those not in the business, sometimes you want to actually help them get out in a comfortable way without burdening the business. So in Oregon, it was fun choosing some brands here in the controlling ownership stage. I don't know if Ellen Britton and Robert are in the audience. There you go. I've decided to pick on you today. So that would be the stage that Ellen's in. And then at the same level, here you have controlling owner Tom Gary, who is second generation, but he's a majority owner, so he's definitely a controlling owner. And you have Josh Bergstrom, who is not only a founding owner, but he's also a second generation who's a controlling owner at this point. So you have different flavors of this. And then if you look at maturity, Adelsheim. So David Adelsheim would fall in this camp. Then you get into the Sibling Partnership stage. So I picked on Maria earlier, and certainly the Sokol-Blosser team is another one. And then it was harder to find a third-generation a cousin partnership, but I do believe I'm correct with this one. So knowing pretty much what your next step is going to be is what this conversation is all about. So what kind of decisions do you have to make down the line? The other and final point here is you've all heard this I suspect, that less than 2% actually make it to and past the cousin partnership stage. So it's challenging, and it's, as Keith said earlier, it takes a lot of resources. It takes knowing when and how to build enough profitability into your business so you can take those complex steps of engaging family and other folks in the next step. So we're going to run through the models that Keith presented this morning, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of the decisions you make at different stages. So the first one would be growing from 5,000 cases to 10,000. And so I'm not showing any numbers, I'm just talking here. You already did that. So from a strategic standpoint, what happens when you're growing and doubling in size from 5,000 cases? And more often than not, what you need is a plan. So you need to have a 5-year plan. You need to have maybe a 10-year plan if you own vineyards. You have to carry that plan out. And it's not an easy thing to do because you're betting on the future. But you need to know how your numbers come together around your business in the business model you're looking to build. And it's back to this conversation in the morning, is it's very hard to build a business unless you know what success looks like. What's your vision of the future? What are your goals? And then build a plan to support those and see how that sorts things out. The second part of this step is sales. Without sales, you might as well go back to 5,000. And so building sales plans that can drive consistent revenues. I spoke with a couple folks this morning after our presentation, and it was all about, well, I'm on the plane a lot, I'm going to the East Coast, I'm going to the West Coast, I'm going everywhere. But the issue here is not just selling a case of wine to someone one time. You want to repeat those sales. So it's not just attracting new customers, but building loyalty with that audience. So sales, the other side of this phase is being able to not just build FOB. In fact, I would say focus on DTC, focus on 4,000 cases. When you've hit 4,000 cases, you know you'll have something that pencils in from a profitability standpoint. And then build regionally, not nationally, at this size. It costs a lot of money, and there's very little profitability in FOB for you, almost up until 100,000 cases, honestly. I mean, when you look at Rob McMillan and Christian Miller this morning and some of the information they gave us. The third thing that's a strategic decision when you're moving and growing is timing of key personnel. It's the biggest question I get is, when do I hire, a strong national salesperson, or when do I hire someone who can oversee all my direct-to-consumer so I actually can build it? When do I hire an accounting manager? Those kinds of things. And then the other side of the strategic decision in this growth phase has to do with capital expansion. And so limited resources and a lot of demands. And so whether it's I need to expand my tasting room, I need to put more money in marketing so I can actually get traction in sales and get sales going, I need to get more barrels, I need to, the list is endless, right? And what Keith would tell you is timing and focus. And you're going to hear from these gentlemen here about how excess can breed all kinds of problems in the business. So choosing where you spend your money really carefully as you grow, and then timing matters. On the operational side of the equation, you're looking at building out a banking relationship. Line of credit is an essential component of growth. You're also, as a result, building out knowledge and expertise and the ability to do cost accounting and some COGS reporting. And that may take an outsourced CPA relationship, needing some advice from the outside. You're focusing on managing costs at this point with monthly, quarterly operating discipline. And if you do that right now, then you'll actually probably grow faster than some and be able to manage a stronger cash flow situation. And then finally, on the on the operational side is sales reporting. So you want to be able to have granularity, so you actually know where the opportunity is, what's not working in the market, how much your consumers are buying. Are they good consumers or are they less good consumers? We're going to move on to 10,000 cases, moving to 20. And in this case, on the strategic side, we're mostly focused on analytics. Because conceive of moving from 10,000 cases to 20,000. For those who have not been there, you need to be able to scrutinize product mix, contribution margins, growth financing, what's going on with financing, inventory turn, release dates, and if so, then you're optimizing your cash flow and you will see higher returns, but you need to see what you're actually doing. The second thing that's new in this cycle is brand, investing in building a strong brand, because brand builds sales. And in today's market, especially being as competitive as it is, unless you stand for something, then you're no one. And so putting money into, whether it's an outside resource, learning yourself as an owner what brand is all about. This is a new discipline for a lot of folks. And getting on top of that will differentiate you in the market. And then also looking at, again, the operational capital calls on your business. And in this phase, there's if I'm going to go to 20,000 cases, my husband wants to build another winery, or my wife. And should I do that, or should I continue outsourcing? And what I would say is I've worked with 130 wineries throughout the United States, most of them in California, some up here, and those who have waited as long as they could possibly wait before they built that winery have actually done much better from a profitability standpoint long term. And so I've seen this happen. And so I would say really weigh the outsourcing versus the insourcing carefully, run those scenarios that we talked about this morning, understand the impacts. You want to, obviously, quality is everything. You want control over quality, but that quality has to deliver returns to your business. On the operational side of this, it's time for an accounting manager, that full-time person who knows what they're doing, with the help of an outside CPA. And they'll be focused on COGS and financial accounting. That's going to be really important for you. You're building up a stronger banking relationship, because if you decide to build that winery or that tasting room, I would say that tasting room is an important thing, then banking relationship and a little bit more, maybe some long-term debt, not just a credit line. More transparency to sales trends, so buying some of that FOB data or getting some market research that gives you a sense of where the opportunity is from a consumer standpoint. And then hiring and developing strong functional leaders. And this is a phase where more than likely a majority of your team will change over. You'll be hiring a whole new staff. And so expect that. I had a meeting with a group of CEOs the other day, and one person said, hey, I came in and about 20 people had to be turned over, in the last 3 years, and that was hard, especially in a family business. So, some takeaways about growth, and Keith referred to a couple of these. Well, we just said hire the right people. Develop your own leadership. So for the owner in the business who's never taken a business to the next phase, to the phase you're going to be facing, you have two choices. One is you can learn how to do this, and that's maybe a great thing and maybe what you need to do. It may take a little bit longer than the second option, which is hire someone who's been there and can take you through as your president or whatever, the next phase. And maybe you realign yourself as chairman, or maybe you take over wine growing and winemaking, but consider very carefully your leadership as well as an owner and what your role should be for your business going through the next phase. Focus brand, we talked about that, and build that sales machine. Managing complexity, so more detailed plans, more controls, more financial management. Otherwise, you'll have false starts. And embrace analytics. So this is all about running your analytics, running your scenario, your what is, before you actually put those decisions into action. And why? It's because the bigger you get, the more you have at risk, and the more costly the mistakes. So being able to learn how to have that analytic mind. I think Steve Thompson, you were talking about that with me after this morning's session. Bringing more education to the industry around how to think about things like that. So I think this is my final slide. Beware of growing pains because you're increasing production capacity, because you're exploring and expanding into new markets, because there is a cash drain when you build up inventory. Growth is like that in this industry. Then you do need capital. And an underfinanced business very, very rarely is a successful business. So you do need to think about capital as you're growing. Okay, so it is a little after 4, and we have until, what time? 4:45? 4:45, exactly, we're on time, I love it. Keith, I'm handing this over to you. I'm going to take this off of here so we can use it. Oh, I'm supposed to put this out of the way as well. That way you guys can see us as well. There you go.
Gosh, I feel a little naked up here now without the without the podium in front of me. Well, I think what we're going to do, this is a panel discussion here. We'd like to also have a conversation with everyone in the audience here as well. So we want to make it as dynamic as we can. I'll try to keep control of things, which normally doesn't happen very well, but we'll give it a try. What I'd like to do now, just a short introduction for everyone here so everyone knows who everyone is. Just very shortly for me, I'm Keith Myers, CPA at Perkins & Company. Do valuation work primarily, but a lot of consulting work in the industry for a lot of the wineries. I've worked with a lot of you out there over the years. And we'll go here with Eric.
My name is Eric McLaughlin. I'm the director of the Wine and Spirits Division for Xfair. We provide management consulting and strategic planning and mostly mergers and acquisitions advisory services to the wineries and vineyards of the Pacific Northwest. Prior to that, I was 20-some years as an operator in the wine industry.
Gary Mortensen. I'm the president of Stoller Family Estate and the general manager of Chehalem Winery. This is a fun conversation because at Stoller we've taken the winery from 9,500 cases to 41,000 cases in 4 years. So kind of maybe I can help out on some leveraging of that knowledge. Before that, in 1988 to 99, I was the vice president at Sokolblosser Winery, and in between that I did a whole bunch of technology startup stuff.
So I'll work backwards. I've been inside as a general manager type person in large corporations, high tech like this gentleman, and small startups. Before coming into the wine industry about 15 years ago, where I built out my own business, a strategic advisory business, executive advice, and I have worked with over 130 wineries throughout the western United States. So it's been an amazing adventure. In doing so, I would say a large number of them have successfully transitioned. So our focus is on businesses that are transitioning, trying to grow. And a good number of them, in fact, 8 of them recently sold in the last 18 months. So companies like Benziger, Patson Hall, J Wine, and a few others we've had great pleasure working with. And I think that's enough.
All right, I'm going to start this off with a general question to the panel. And this is something we touched on both this morning and this afternoon, and it's the issue of a winery understanding where it is and what its brand is, and basically setting goals. So I'd like to talk, or hear at least from Eric and from Gary for sure, on the issue of setting goals and strategically setting goals and directions for a winery, how important that is, and some maybe practical examples of what's happened when a winery does do that.
Go ahead.
All right. In the wine business, they say you make 1,000 decisions from vine to bottle, and that's probably minimizing, actually, the number of decisions you have to make as we go forward. And so there's a lot of opportunities in our daily operations of running a winery to make decisions about how to do things. And what I see, getting to see an awful lot of businesses from the outside looking in, I see a lot of wineries that that don't have a really clear direction or a defined direction or defined criteria through which they make their decisions. And what my experience has been, both as an operator and as a consultant to other businesses, is that if you have a really defined criteria by which you make decisions and a really clear objective as to what your goals are, then you can use that as a filter through which you make all of your daily decisions. For instance, prior to doing the work with Xphere, I was the senior vice president at Seven Hills Winery, which we recently sold to the Crimson Wine Group last year. And as we were growing, we grew the winery very quickly over a several-year period of time. It looked very similar, frankly, to the models that were put up there. But we grew it with the dual goal of either potentially selling the winery or building the winery to a certain size that it would be financially sustainable to create other transition options for the founders. And we didn't have a clear objective. We didn't have it predetermined which course we were gonna go through. So we used those two criteria through which we made every single decision at the winery through that 4-year period of time of growth. We said, so with each individual decision, some big, some small, we said, is this the decision we would make if we're going to keep this winery when it gets to 25,000 cases? Is this the decision we would make if we are going to sell this winery when we get it to 25,000 cases? And we had to say yes to both of those to be able to move forward on any decision. And it created incredible discipline to our business. And it allowed us to use, kind of the philosopher's term of the Occam's razor, to cut away all the meaninglessness, all the meaningless decisions and distractions that very easily creep into any organization, especially a winery organization. And it created a lot of focus and drive and ability to achieve that quite efficiently for us.
I think to build on that, when I first got to Stoller in 2012, the brand was, I think that we weren't sure what the brand was, and I think that that's something that everyone should ask themselves is, what is your brand? And what is your DNA surrounded around the brand itself? Because I think a lot of times, if you don't know that about yourself, you can't expect your customers to know that about you. And it also sets you up for scaling. And that's a metric that I look at everything is, can it scale? Can the brand scale? Can the team scale? Can you build on this? And as an example, Dixie told me she was involved with Stoller at the time, and there was a label, a reserve label, that was in the process of being made, and there was 172 different iterations of that label. And maybe that sounds familiar to some of you out there. And that means that you just, fundamentally, we weren't at Stoller understanding ourselves. And so we took the exercise and the time to really fundamentally get at our DNA. So I think you have to ask yourself, what is your DNA? And Deb, you'd made that comment, was it 9,000 wineries are competing for how much? 10% of the business. 9,000 wineries are competing for 10% of the business. So you damn well better know yourself before you go out there and try to compete. And I think, but that's a fundamental lesson. I think it's dog eat dog out there. I mean, it's not just about that piece, but what are you willing to do to build your brand out? And I think those are the questions you have to ask on a fundamental level is, are you willing to innovate? Are you willing to examine yourself and say, I've always liked the way this looks on my label. I've always liked the way this sounds. And being willing to blow all that up and just reimagine your business. At Chehalem, we have a back room in the tasting room that was a warehouse. And we've blown that up and turned it into a selling space because we're looking at the business differently. We're looking at every place that we can to create value and an opportunity for ourselves. So I think when you look at your business and come in, try to find a way to do an exercise to find that fresh eyes and re-examine everything you're doing, that there might be some value there.
So this is my favorite topic, alignment, getting a vision in place, setting goals is what I do in my sleep. But quite frankly, when you're trying to drive a business forward, unless you have all key stakeholders, meaning owners and key employees, in fact all employees and maybe customers aligned and on the same page with the same vision, you're constantly moving uphill. You're constantly moving uphill. And so wouldn't it be nice to move downhill with everyone pulling in the same direction? So husband and wife, business partners, general manager, management team, pulling the group together. A number of you have been through the exercise of just sitting down and putting some pictures up on the walls and talking about your vision and your values and talking about your culture and your goals. And then agreeing, or agreeing to disagree until you figure out what next. But until you actually get alignment, it's very hard to push the whole bus forward. It's very hard to get people on the bus and get them excited. And so that's an important part of planning. The other side of this is results. And so, working with Gunlach Banshu, 150-year-old winery, maybe even more older than that, they're one of the oldest wineries out there, 6 generations, and helping Jeff think about what was important to him. In his case, he was trying to bring price up. And so part of his goal was to set average revenues per case at double what he was making within a 5-year period, and we went ahead and did that. Delicato family vineyards, a much larger winery, they defined a clear vision and knew they needed to head up in price, like a lot of large wineries, premiumization. This was about 10 years ago. And they were at very low price points. They've been around Prohibition. They kind of stayed in that low end. And so they needed to acquire a Napa winery. And so that was part of their vision. And they did that within time frame, and now they're number 4th winery in the United States. So those are just some examples, and there are plenty more out there. It's about results.
I think it's also important to figure out what are you not willing to do and what are you not about. I think that's one of the mistakes that a lot of wineries make is chasing every good idea, because there's no shortage of good ideas, but it's defining what are the best ideas for your particular winery, for your particular brand, and pursuing only those. I mean, for instance, when I'll use Seven Hills again as an example. Seven Hills was one of the pioneer wineries in the Walla Walla Valley, pioneered Bordeaux varietals there, but also Rhone varietals. Casey was the second producer of Syrah in the Walla Walla Valley. And it also had a very popular $20 red table wine that was very popular, got 90-point scores, could be virtually infinitely scalable. The distributors loved it. And one of the first things we did when I got there is we killed all the Rhone varietals and the cash flow red wine. We walked away from 40% of our revenue overnight while we're trying to grow the winery. It seemed like a radical thing to do, but it was about defining what the winery was about by defining what it's not about. So going forward, we only produced Bordeaux varietal wines. And, I know we're here in Oregon, and Seven Hills was founded as an Oregon winery on the Oregon side of the Walla Walla Valley. But part of the problem when you get east of the mountains, the blessing is you can grow and make anything you want, and the curse is that people do. So you have to define as an individual brand what do you stand for, and that is a process of omission, of choosing what you're not going to pursue. So we put that laser-like focus on Bordeaux varietals and grew that, and we grew only wines that had sustainable margins. This is, well, we'll get into sustainable margins later, but we killed the sacred cash cow of the most scalable wine because it wasn't sufficiently profitable. We decided to make the profitable business model and then grow it, rather than grow it and then try and figure out how to make profit on that later.
So there's really 2 different ways of planning. There's the outside in, I guess, inside the box I would call it, which is more tactical. You build on what you have and you evolve it and get somewhere. Or there's the outside the box, which what you're talking about is a more proactive approach to thinking about market opportunity and building out towards that. So at Stoller, did you have to put a plan in place right up front, or what happened?
Oh, we just made a big mess. I guess some of the Stoller folks back there, we kind of made it up as we went a little bit, but but we put some basic tenets in place at Stoller, and I think that the one thing that we've all got to remember, yes, we're all in the wine business, and it's lovely being in the wine business, but you're really not in the wine business. You're in the sales and marketing business, and you got to remember that, because again, there's 9,000 of your competitors competing for this little tiny piece, and if you're not in the sales and marketing business, you're in the wrong business. So you've got to take that approach about where you are. And, we took the approach where we knew we wanted to scale. We weren't exactly sure how we were going to scale, but we wanted to start fundamentally with the brand and make sure that the brand was taking. And, there's a lot of ownership pushback sometimes. Bill's not in the room, is he? The turkey. Bill loves him some turkey. There's a turkey farm, if you didn't know that, at Stoller. And nobody cares. Right? Bill cares. Bill cares about turkeys. Try to sell a turkey associated with the wine. But so it's that kind of...
November it works.
Yeah, November, that's exactly right, with the gravy boat.
For 2 days.
Yeah, that's right. So, but I mean, those are the kinds of things where you have to look at yourself and say, you know, I really love this because it reminds me of when my kids were little, but it doesn't matter because the market doesn't care. So you've got to remember that all of us are in the sales and marketing business, and it's all about the brand. And if you invest in the brand, then you can start to trust your strategy. And, you know, if you ever come into my office, it's nothing but whiteboards, because that's the technologist in me. I just love whiteboarding. But there's a method to the madness, which is we're constantly planning ahead. We're constantly looking 3 to 5 years ahead. And, you know, even if you're not even planning on growing that much, if you're still planning ahead, anticipating the economy, being a good futurist, looking at every trend that you can look at and say, what happens if the economy crashes? Because we've just invested in all this reserve. What are we going to do? And having a contingency plan based on that, just in case, knowing that your market will come back to you and the market will come back, but in the meantime, you have to stay alive. What you won't want to do is have a whole boatload of reserve and have to discount it. So what is your contingency plan for that? So as you continue to think about your business, those are the aspects that I think are so important. And people that know me will hear me say words like fail fast. You know, try things. If they don't work, fail them fast, because, you know, not everyone has ready access to cash flow. And so if you want to try something, believe in it, trust it, but if it doesn't look like it's going to work, also have the intestinal fortitude to fail it too, and move on to the next thing. But it's really getting to know yourself and your brand, and believing that you've tapped into something in a consumer that's going to give you an edge over those 8,999 other people out there trying to take your business away from you.
Yeah, good question. Good point, Deb. I want to make sure that we're addressing questions from the audience. I mean, there's been a lot discussed here. So this is an opportunity right now. Raise your hand. We've got some mics around. Here we go, up here in the front. This is being taped, so I want to make everyone on your best behavior here, because someone might actually download this. Yes, your question.
Great, now I'm going to stutter. No, you mentioned this morning and again this afternoon about capitalizing on a price point that works, and there's been a couple mentions of lower price points and getting rid of those cash cows. I think when we looked at the state of the industry this morning, knowing that outside of Oregon, our brands are struggling to be recognized, and we hit our distributors and they don't want a higher price point, but we know we need that to hit our margins. I just want to know from the four of you some suggestions, ideas, or experiences you've had in order to change those price points successfully.
If you can support a low price point with acceptable margins, there's no problem with it. It's really a margin game. So you have to get the cost of goods right. You have to be able to produce that wine at an appropriate cost to have a contributory margin to your business. So lower price points aren't inherently bad. Low margins are what imperils businesses is when they grow their low margin business. And this is a cycle we see happen over and over again, because it's the easiest part of your business to grow. As you mentioned, your distributors, they're very receptive to lower price point wines. So if you can do that at sustainable margins, go after it. Go for it. There's no problem with that. But if you can't do it at sustainable margins, you won't win that game. You will lose. There's too many players in there that have more capital capacity, that have a higher threshold for pain, who have more efficiencies in their operations. You can't win that game unless you have your margin structure appropriately.
It's the old Donald Rumsfeld thing about you go to war with the wines you have, not the wines you want. And at Sokolblosser back in the day, at Sokolblosser back in the day, we were making a lot of Müller Thurgau and a lot of Riesling, and you could see that at some point there was going to be a limit to what we could do with that, and yet it was important to our cash flow. And so we started thinking about what could we do differently with that. And so I guess my challenge always is don't just walk away from something if you can reimagine it and if you can do that successfully. So we took Müller-Thurgau and Riesling and made Evolution, and that worked out pretty well. And it was really, and why is Evolution successful? Because we really nailed the branding. And I think that's, you got to be a little fearless in this business, because again, you got 9,000 people wanting to take your business away, and that's just those 9,000. So you gotta be a little bit crazy in this, because if you're not, if you're just trying to play by the rules and just follow on the shoulders of the person following ahead of that person, you don't know what cliff they're driving off of. So you gotta trust yourself a little bit, and if you embrace the idea that you are in the marketing and sales business more than anything else, look at your brand and say, what about this could I do? What market, what niche could I fill? I mean, look at what Union Wine Company is doing. How badass is that? I mean, those guys are thought leaderships out there right now. And so who's the next person that's going to come up with a great killer idea? In technology, it's first to market with a killer application, right? That's what they're doing. I think that one of the mistakes that in Oregon we make is we get really, really, really into what Oregon other wine industries are doing and not looking outside of the industry. And I'm not just talking about the wine industry. I mean, there's a lot of people that haven't figured it out, and we're all looking at them going, what are they going to do? Look outside of the industry in general, because I think your answers for a lot of this is going to come from outside of that. So you've got to be innovators. And if you're not, again, there's 9,000 people that are just going to be going with you. So there's only 10% of those guys are winning. So you got to make sure that you're in that category.
I can't add too much more except to repeat what I said this morning, and that is if you're having problems in the FOB market, you should be looking back at direct-to-consumer. And if you're going to be spending time and money in any direction, you're under 100,000 cases, you're under 10,000 cases, you're under 5,000 cases, you should be putting that money and your effort and your focus on DTC, where you have a chance of making more money and where you have a chance of building more brand.
Well, that's the important thing about brand, is that a lot of people misunderstand what brand means. You have a trademark, you have a label, and people think that means they have a brand. A brand is something that allows you to sell your wine above commodity pricing. The strength of your brand is what allows you to sell your wine more than your neighbors that is comparatively as good or has the same features and benefits. That's the definition of how strong your brand is and how important it is to invest in your brand, because that's the only way you're going to be able to realize higher margins than your competitors. I mean, I see Chris Figgins over here, and I think that's one of the most well-disciplined brands in the history of the Northwest, what they've done at Leonetti, and that's just a tremendous testament to the power of branding. And what they did is they got it right at the beginning. They took the high ground from the beginning and kept that high ground for the last, 40 years now, Chris? For 40 years. There was no ground before. I mean, they were the first winery in Walla Walla. So they went right for the top, grabbed the brass ring, and have been able to hold the high ground and continue to produce the highest average price wines in the Walla Walla Valley, and some in the Northwest. And that's not just because Chris makes great wine. I mean, he does. You have to do that to be that. But that's the power of the brand that allows them to achieve that.
Other questions? I want to add on to one comment that Gary said when he mentioned the fail fast. You do need to be willing to make mistakes in this industry. And from the financial side, we think of this as these are the sunk costs that you have in here, and you need to be able to emotionally separate yourself from those costs when you're making decisions in the future. It's okay to make decisions. It's not okay to continually perpetuate those decisions and double down on those bad decisions. You need to be okay, just say, I thought it was a great idea, didn't work out so well, we'll do better next time, and that's fine. As a matter of fact, you'll never move forward unless you're willing to do that. So, other questions? This has been great. Oh, okay, go ahead.
Hi there. My question is for Gary. When you were at 9,500 cases, what was your DTC split, and what does that look like now, just at a snapshot? And then the second part of that is, Did your product mix change drastically, and what did that look like?
Okay, thanks. Good questions. We invested in a new tasting room, and that was really a key decision to do that. And not everyone can invest in a new tasting room. But it also came with a sea change of the brand mentality on top of it, which was a continued and strengthened commitment to the DTC side. And one of those things was bringing on a dedicated club manager. And you know, growing your club is one thing, and retaining your club is another thing. And so we really put an emphasis on both of those. So the DTC mix, believe it or not, really hasn't changed that much, even though we've doubled and doubled again in size. We went from 400 club members to 3,400 club members for, I guess, 5 years now, because we keep emphasizing that the club as recurring revenue, which I know all of us like up here, it was an important thing to do. But you also have to remember that you want to create value for those club members. And so on the DTC side, anyone that we're hearing, it is important to grow your DTC side is, you know, how are you going to do that and how can you retain that? It's such a fickle world out there that you have to provide value at every step for those. You have to have brand value, but you also have to have something beyond that. What things can you do for your club members that really make them want to never, you're the only club that they ever want to just, they can't afford to drop. And so as we've grown, the product mix, you know, we've grown in every category. We've taken a big chance on things like rosé, and it's paid off extremely well for us. Even though it's a seasonal thing, we started off making 400 cases, and we made almost 7,000 cases this year, and we're going to sell out. Because we've believed in certain categories that we want to push on, and we've seen incremental growth on that. Until last year, we weren't even able to sell it in the FOB market. Which is a really cool thing. So now we're getting it out, and that's allowing us to double our size on that. You know, people say, well, rosé could be a category that's fading. Well, you know what? Right now we're gonna smoke them while we got them, and we're just gonna keep going. And at some point, if it looks like it's diminishing, we're gonna be following the trends, and maybe we'll start to incrementally cut back and reinvest in some alternative branding that would go with that. So you know, it's one of those things where with your DTC, I think you have to almost have to know what your customers want. You have to understand your customers and deliver to them that mix that will allow you to grow your business. I see a lot of times that folks want to just make something that's interesting to them and then expect the customers to buy it. And I think, you know, I've yet to see where that works. So really listening to your customers is like any business. Again, just goes outside of the wine business too. It's any business needs to serve the needs of their customer if you want to grow your business. Hopefully that answers it.
So I want to get one thing off the table. You know, Stoller with Bill behind it, good money, you know, obviously well-financed business. However, your approach to building the business has been a bit different than just leveraging funds from Bill, right?
It is. Coming from startups, you learn a lot of humility. And you only get to eat what you kill. And I think I've got some of the Stoller team here, and I think it was the first thing I said to him was, you know, it's great to have Bill's money behind you, but it's also a curse to have someone, you know, unfettered access to capital behind you. You know, if you're spending a lot of your investment in operations with precious little to show for it, you need to really just stop and go, what are we doing? I know that it's great that we've had Bill's money available. But I also know that if I'd failed him, I wouldn't be up here talking right now. I'd probably be serving you a coffee somewhere. But you know, it's regardless of where that money comes from, it's sacred, and it's a very powerful, very dangerous tool in your hands. And so I take that very, very seriously. And all of our growth has been as if we were working with a bank. We haven't done anything and taken any advantage of the fact that there's, you know, pretty liberal access to funding. So we run this like a startup, and that's really my mentality is, even though we're in a mature stage with our leadership, I'm always just wanting to make sure that we're a step ahead and just constantly running this like a startup because, you know, someone is out there right now out innovating all of us. And so we need to be very, very hungry and very, very aggressive at all the times.
Hi, Dixie. You had a question?
Good afternoon. We're not far from wine time. You all have talked a lot about brand and nailing the brand and growing the brand and understanding your DNA. I'm curious, as I know you're all process-oriented people, if each of you has, I don't know if it's 2 keys to doing that or 5 keys or what does nailing the brand, like how do you do that?
Oh, thank you, Dixie. Wow, that's, that could be another 3 days worth of conversation, right? In fact, there are a couple of great seminars here that are going on around us. For me, it starts with, again, finding out what your market, segmentation, who your customers are out there, and pretty much every project with clients, winery clients, we bring Christian Miller in, and he helps us unveil and understand what the status quo is around your brand, where the opportunity is, and helps us start to think about segmenting customers. So whether it's a consumer audience on the direct-to-consumer side, or whether it's a distributor or account, restaurant on off-premise, we get a lot of data points up front before we start making decisions about brand architecture and brand strategy and product strategy and all those pieces.
Go ahead.
Your brand isn't what you project. Your brand is what people perceive. And that's a fundamental misunderstanding that a lot of people have. People think that their brand is what is the message that they're sending. Your brand is the message that people are receiving, and it's usually not exactly the same as the message that you intend to send. So to create good brand discipline requires some of that analytics to figure out what do people perceive your brand to be, and the honesty to be able to look at that plainly and identify where the strengths and the weaknesses are in that. And I've been through this process several times with different wineries where you don't like the feedback, all the feedback that you get on it. And you have to figure out, how do we minimize our weaknesses and how do we maximize our strengths, and put all of your messaging behind that. And then have the discipline to continue to send the same message over and over and over again, and continue to have to study the market to make sure it's being received that way, and it's working for you. But it is very much a mirror approach that you have to take and see how other people are seeing you, not just the message that you're trying to send.
Yeah, I totally support that, and it's, I think there's a tendency to deal in alternate facts when it comes to how we see our brand and how the brand sees us. And so it's how do you align those two pieces together? At Stoller, we had, when I first got there, we had, some of you may remember, JV and SV wines. So we had the JV and then the SV. And I think I was there about a tenth of a second when the first person went, oh, JV, like junior varsity, so it's not as good as the varsity. It's like, so what decision-making process went into your head to think that that was probably a smart thing to do? And yet for Bill, who plays basketball, it's like, oh, this is kind of cool, we'll do it this way. And it also means junior vines and senior vines. And nobody cares. In fact, you kind of damage your brand when you do stupid things like that. So, sorry, Bill. This is being taped. Edit that part, please. But the reality is again, you've got to know yourself. You got to know your brand, and people are going to buy authenticity. And I think that's, you're hearing more and more about that. Are you being authentic to your brand? Are you really? Because if you are, then I think it's easier for people to buy that than it is, some grand facade of something that doesn't exist. And so if you do that, I think that tapping into that, again, I just keep going back to know yourself and know your DNA. And so we're constantly looking out and seeing what's the market saying. Because at some point, we're hearing, hey, your brand's getting a little tired. Maybe it needs a little refresh. And sometimes that's maybe just a little tweak. And are you willing to do that? I remember telling Susan Blosser one time, these labels don't love you back. They really don't. They're just labels, and they're ugly. So let's change them. So, but again, and when you do that, a lot of times you'll find a pretty nice little bump in the market. If you do it right. If you're again authentic to the brand. So. Don't be afraid to audit yourself. Don't be afraid to get opinions on how it's doing. Your distribution network, some of your trusted customers, the ones that you can really trust, have them tell you something about the brand, and be open to hear it, and then be open to act on it.
One other small point. Brands require nourishment. They require resources, and there's a tendency in this very creative industry we're in to create a brand every time we want to invent a new product. And so you see a lot of brands and very small businesses, and at some point those businesses grow bigger, and each brand requires resources. So needing to really think through how to build equity, and is it a one-brand shop or maybe several brands, but then how are you going to nourish them?
I think one of the important things that I want to make sure we cover today is the concept of brand architecture and the portfolio within your brand architecture. Many wineries make similar amounts of many different wines, and as you grow, you need to start being strategic about what you're going to grow and what you're not going to grow. If you're making 5,000 cases of wine and you're making 500 cases of 10 different wines and you want to grow to 10,000 cases, you're not going to start making 1,000 cases of those same wines. You're not going to grow them all proportionately. So defining a brand architecture that is sustainable as you grow is really critical. And this is a mistake that a lot of people make. So you're not going to grow everything proportionally. So say you're at 5,000 cases, and say you're making 10 different wines at 500 cases each on average. And when you're going to 10,000 cases, you're going to define those 10 wines, and I would submit that you take 7 of them, and you don't grow those at all. Those are going to stay at 500 cases, and those are going to still be DTC. You're going to take 3 of them, and you're going to grow them. One of which, so now we got 5,000 more cases to make up with only 3 SKUs, right? So of that additional 5,000 cases in sales, one of those should represent at least 3,500 of those 5,000 cases of growth that you're going to have, and the other 2 should represent the balance of the 1,500 cases of growth, and so on. So as you grow, rather than having a portfolio that's really flat and wide, you build it more like a pyramid. So it doesn't mean you have to necessarily make fewer wines, because particularly if you have a robust and want to develop a robust DTC business, you can have small quantities of lots of different SKUs, and that can be the lifeblood of your DTC business. But as you're starting to grow, particularly into distribution, they don't want 10 SKUs or 20 SKUs. They want 3 SKUs, and they want to know which one of those 3 SKUs is really important. And that's what's going to drive your brand. So ultimately, as you reach maturity, say you get up to that 20,000 case mark, you should have one single wine that represents over 50% of your revenue. And then you should have 2 wines that should represent maybe 25 to even 30% of the rest of your revenue. So now you're up to 75 or 80% of your revenue in 3 SKUs. Then I don't care how many more wines you make, as long as you can sell them all DTC after that. You can make 20 different wines after that, and they'll make 200 cases of this and 500 cases of that, and that can make up all your special DTC flavor, and a few of those can trickle out into distribution to be the nice window dressing to it. But that's one of the most important strategic things to look at when you're starting to grow, is which SKUs are you going to grow. Now those 3 SKUs that are going to drive all of that growth for you, those have to be at sustainable margins. You cannot grow anything that doesn't have a sustainable margin to it, particularly if you're going to grow into DTC or grow into FOB sales or distribution sales, where you're going to be selling the wines at essentially 50% of the average case price that you're getting out of your cellar door.
I'll just add to that and say, if it's a white wine and you can't sell it in a year, don't make it. Don't make it. Or make very little of it, because it just seems like I'm familiar with inventories of Rieslings and Chardonnays that are 3-4 years old. What are you going to do with those? I mean, honestly. I mean, at the same time, if you've got some Pinot Noir that you can pull out from and do library sales or make value to your customers, great. I mean, that's a strategic investment, and you can do small amounts that you release every year, and every year you can raise the price on those a little bit. That's cool. But just watch your mix really carefully.
Well, the whole point of white wine, from a financial perspective, I mean, I love to drink white wine too, but the whole point of white wine is cash flow, okay? The fast inventory of white wine and rosé is the financial purpose of it in your winery. So if you can't turn it quickly, you shouldn't be making white wine.
I had the great pleasure of working with Patson Hall a little over 10 years ago, and at the time they were at the beginning, one of the first wineries that started selling single vineyard in the national market, and they had about 16 or 18 of these, and they were trying to sell them a little bit everywhere. And bless their souls, thank God the wine was beautiful. They were about 12,000 cases in those days. And so we worked very hard on rationalizing their portfolio and thinking about which wines should be sold in national distribution, what their margins were, what position meant. and then pared down the portfolio and started helping them build out a direct-to-consumer channel. In those days, they were just selling through a collaborative tasting room downtown, and they didn't even have a winery, they didn't even have a tasting room, and they rented a space in an office park and put a little bit of money in place and started a tasting room going. So they went from 12,000 cases to over 45,000 cases when they sold to Saint Michel recently. And it was on the back of the cash flow in the national market, a couple wines that they are able to sell at $45 an item, and the rest through DTC, a fairly strong DTC channel. So it takes a lot of thought, discipline.
Okay, just like many things, we just get into it and we're out of time. Does anyone have a very short question? Otherwise, I'm going to call it. We're going to go from talking about wine to drinking wine. It's 4:45. We'll be up here for a little bit afterwards. You're a great audience. Appreciated everyone coming. We'll see you all again tomorrow.